Foundation, and a lot of the work that I do is related to bringing the science of our Marine Lab and our Habitat Wildlife Management divisions into the regulatory or policy realm. And of course, one of the big ones that has become even bigger part of the pie is water. And Everglades is all about the water. Without water, we have no Everglades. So this is my connection to that bigger picture of Everglades. Been doing this for 25 years now, and so my background was as a limnologist and marine scientist who somehow got talked into a policy job, I just have to say. So we'll see what we can do with this. You've heard the term about draining the swamp more recently, but I want you to know, for the accuracy of history, that draining the swamp was the platform for the Florida governor's race in 1904. Of course, they were talking about a different swamp. They were talking about the Everglades. And it was the concept that that worthless land that's all wet and it's just growing mosquitoes and alligators and snakes, it doesn't give us any return on investment. Little did they know the value of wetlands back then. But it started a progression, as you can see through time, of man alteration through the landscape that eventually, today, leads us to having the largest artificially engineered system on the planet for water management. And this water system we talk about, the Greater Everglades ecosystem, starts in Orlando and occupies the southern third of the peninsula of Florida. So the water from Orlando comes down through the Kissimmee Valley, enters Lake Okeechobee, and historically went south to the Everglades and into Florida Bay. A little bit of that water would come to the west, but none of it went to the east, and that was the Everglades ecosystem. Well, today, with all these changes and alterations and dredging and ditching and shifting of water around, we have what I call the Everglades squeeze. The red area that you see immediately south of the lake is the Everglades agricultural area, 700,000 acres of land that grows sugarcane and citrus and rice and corn and celery and potatoes and tomatoes and all of those things that feed the winter vegetable supply for the nation. The outline on the right-hand side in yellow is the encroachment of the lower East Coast, Miami-Dade, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, into the historic Everglades. So what we have left in between are those WCA1s, Water Conservation Area 1, 2, and 3. So what we have today is about half the real estate that Mother Nature designed to occupy and treat the same amount of water coming into the system. One of the changes that occurred, driven by hurricanes, as so much of this landscape is, was changing Lake Okeechobee, a lake that used to expand across the landscape and get up to 24 feet deep, and then in the dry season it would shrink down, leave behind those nutrients, those high organic loads that could oxidize away, but they also created the richest soils that grew tomatoes. They talk about growing so fast and so big they would split their skin. So hurricanes that devastated the area resulted in a program to contain the lake with a dike. And so today, instead of spreading out across the landscape in the wet season and contracting in the dry season, it basically moves up and down inside of the dike. And because there's a dike, as you see in the upper right-hand corner, none of that water can go to the Everglades the way it once did. There are channelized cuts that draining the swamp started, and those are cuts, those canals still take water for irrigation down through the Everglades. But that free flow of water, that feeding of water, a precious water resource into the Everglades and Florida Bay no longer exists. And while we're talking about Lake Okeechobee, we have to understand that that is the liquid heart where everything from the north comes in, the things around the lake, the communities around the lake drain into the lake, and then that lake is that transfer point, the place where water has to be moved. It has to be collected and then moved to the different outlets. And as a result, we have some problems with the water quality of the lake. No longer do we let it operate the way Mother Nature allowed, and we've got the dike, but also we have a lot of development in the landscape that drains into it. What this graph is basically showing on the far right-hand side is that the 1970s is when we started to see algal blooms in the lake, the 1970s. But the monitoring and evaluation really didn't start until the 1980s, mid-1980s, and that's when you start to see these bars. And just for simplicity, because I know you can't read this from where you sit, the green is where the lake phosphorus level should be. The red is where it is, and we have a goal of 140 metric tons. That's the green bar, the green section, 140 metric tons. We are, with the 2018, here on the right-hand side, this loading, we were over 1,000 metric tons, 1,048 metric tons. So we're way outside the box in terms of phosphorus. And of course, phosphorus helps feed those algal blooms that we have. And I do want to point out that the hurricanes of 2005 and Irma in 2017, you see these occur, and then you see a lag effect, and by the next year, you see some of those loading elevated phosphorus levels. And so what we have created are a series of challenges for ourselves. So for those of you that like puzzles, we are the place you want to spend some more time, because we've got the ultimate puzzle. We have, of course, lost half of the real estate that used to accommodate all the water that in this lower part of the system. We've disconnected the system that used to flow in and out of each other. The water, when it's drained, flows in faster and gets less treatment. We have less habitat for wildlife and soils to work on. That means it's not being filtered. It's not being cleaned by Mother Nature just the way it had been. With the dike constructed around the water, around the lake, we've redirected the water to mostly the west coast and some to the east coast. We created a St. Lucie Canal on the east coast, and we don't get the water to the south to the Everglades. So while the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie rivers and estuaries get too much water, the Everglades in Florida Bay are starved for water. So they're just juxtaposed there, but because of the way we've engineered the system, it doesn't work. And that is all related to having taken out the storage capacity that was once there. So that's our target, the storage capacity. I'm going to switch to the Caloosahatchee system, which is connected, just to point out and orient you to the fact that in the upper right-hand corner, the Caloosahatchee, west of the lake, was the western Everglades. The way Mother Nature designed this, before we had better ideas about designing it, the western Everglades wrapped around Lake Okeechobee. And so from the lake to about LaBelle, there was sawgrass and marsh and wetlands, and a slow elevation change to the point where a geologic rise met just east of LaBelle and created a waterfall. For that western Everglades, met the valley of the Caloosahatchee, and so we had a quarter-mile of rapids and a waterfall of about 4 to 10 feet that delivered water into the Caloosahatchee. That water that was coming out of the lake and out of the marshes was getting clean. The whole time it was flowing slowly through that marshland, resting in lakes, and then making its way slowly towards the west. Once we realized that with the dike around the lake, we had to get rid of water in a different direction. It wasn't going to go to the Everglades. We realized that that historic Caloosahatchee, which you see in blue on the lower graphic, was just not very efficient at moving water. It might have been lovely and beautiful and all kinds of wild, but it wasn't a good design for moving water. So the Corps of Engineers was directed to dredge the canal, straighten it out, and that's the dark line you see in the background. So that's our historic river, and that's the river that was created. Now, it's been expanded even since then, but today we also have a direct connection to the lake, and there are, by necessity, 3 lock and dam structures that pool that water up to move it slower, slow it down, and allow us to control it. And I have to speak up on behalf of the lake, because the lake gets blamed for everything. If you read media reports or you listen to people complaining, they'll say it's that damn lake, it's the water from this, it's the water from that. This is the purpose for this slide, is to point out that our watershed, that's the area north and south of the 75-mile-long Caloosahatchee that runs from the lake today to the Gulf of Mexico, our watershed in pink here is almost 2 Lake Okeechobes in size. And there are plenty of times when we have no discharge coming out of the lake and we have harmfully high flows just coming from our watershed. So it's all of us, it's the whole system that works together. So we can't blame it anymore on just the lake. This sets us up in the Caloosahatchee for what a condition that I coined back in 2004 called the Goldilocks condition. We either here on the Caloosahatchee get way too much water because we're the main outlet, or we don't get enough. It's very convenient that they can cut off water from Lake Okeechobee when it's dry, and we need that water. And so the best example I can give you is the real system itself. This is the same month, June. On the left-hand side, that's 2005, one of our highest rainfall and flow years in recent memory. The dark plume you see coming out between the islands is fresh water that extended 25 miles offshore for months at a time. When that happens, it means that the whole mixing zone, that place in the river where the salt and fresh water mix, has been eliminated, which means all the fish and shellfish and everything else that need a mixing zone to reproduce, they're gone. You're losing year classes of fisheries when that happens. And that happened for months. But just 3 years later, we were in the second year of a 7-year drought. And the Water Management District cut off the water supply from Lake Okeechobee, deferring it instead to the EAA, that Everglades Agricultural Area. We need about 1 inch off the lake a month just to keep the system healthy. We got 1 inch in 8 months. And what happened was you have the western lock at the top of the photo. The dark going towards the top is the estuary. That's where the tidal waters from the Gulf come in and meet the upriver lock. And everything behind that is fresh water. Although it's not very fresh in this photograph, it's full of cyanobacteria, toxic algae bloom. And that is the consequence of not having any water mixing, having it sit in a pool with lots of nutrients, lots of sunlight, and warm temperatures. And that's kind of what happened on a much larger scale this year. For those of you who were not here this summer and into the fall, we had a double whammy of events. On the one hand, from Lake Okeechobee down the entire river channel, 75 miles, we had a toxic blue-green algae bloom like you saw in that other photograph and in these photographs here. This is a freshwater algae that produces a toxin that depends on excess nitrogen and phosphorus, the same things that are in fertilizer. When those fertilizer elements are in the water, they do just what fertilizers do on land. They grow green things. Usually it's grass, but in this case it's algae. That started and came down to the Gulf where it met up with a red tide that had started almost a year previous. That's a marine organism that starts off the bottom of the Gulf, 10 to 40 miles offshore, upwells into the coastal waters, and gets pushed there with tides and winds. But like a stray animal, if you feed it, it will stay. It doesn't go away. And that's just what we did this summer, not intentionally. Nothing wrong with stray animals. That's how I get most of mine. But they aren't green and they aren't red. So this is just a satellite image that helps you understand that even from space we could see that algal bloom that started in June in Lake Okeechobee. Our rainy season began very early in the last 2 weeks of May in 2018. And if you can imagine a dry sponge, you know you can't pick up very much water with a dry sponge. You got to get a little wet, work it up first, then it absorb. Soils are the same way. After an extended dry period, that first flush of rain, often a lot of that washes off because the soils are too dry to absorb it. The same thing happened here, and those first flushes of rain bring the most nutrients into the system because they don't get captured so easily. And so we saw a progression through time, through the fall, of this algal bloom. It affected wildlife, it affected our recreation, And of course, this is a toxic condition. This blue-green algae produces a toxin called microcystin. And it particularly got back up into marinas and canals and waters that were not flushing with the tide, but it was certainly all through the entire river system. One of the things that's important to understand is that the nitrogen and phosphorus that are needed for this algae to bloom, the cyanotoxins, the microcystin toxins, are not just in the water, they're also in the air. And because this is a very stable toxin, you can't boil the water and clean it. So even after the bloom goes away, the sand can retain a certain amount of toxin. We don't test for that. We don't have any standards in Florida. So why would you test? You don't have standards, why test? So we don't. But what we do know is that there are recreational water exposure limits. Now this isn't air or sand, this is just the water. For years, the World Health Organization had a standard of 10 micrograms per liter. In 2016, the EPA set a new standard that was less than half that, which means that at 4 micrograms per liter, you do not want to be exposing yourself in the water. So that's less than half of what we had been working with. And this past summer, for those of you that saw the photographs and all the rest, the canals in Cape Coral had between 1,000 up to 38,000 micrograms per liter. It was an astounding visual sight, but I just be glad this isn't a scratch and sniff slide, because it's a smell you cannot describe. It's like nothing else, and it's very unpleasant. The red tide that we had started the year before. After Hurricane Irma hit in September of 2017, within the next month in the Gulf of Mexico, we started to see the red tide. Again, it's that marine organism that we know from the 1500s, from Spanish arrival, that these are explosions of bloom conditions that would show up periodically, but then they would die off and they'd go away. The change today is that they aren't going away as fast, they're lasting a lot longer, and they're coming back much more frequently than we ever had any reason to believe they had in the past. We had aerosol toxins that we can clearly measure a mile inland, and some cases that's been reported further inland. This is a research area that I think we'll learn more about. There's also a scent to this, or a sensation that comes with this algae. If you've ever experienced it, it might be your eyes, it might be your sinuses, it might be a cough, a tickle. This is a little bit more friendly in that it warns you, get away, get away. Whereas the blue-green algae doesn't necessarily do that. We had record sea turtle deaths. We have never in recorded history seen as many sea turtle deaths as we had this year. Gulf-wide, over 1,200, and just on our islands, almost 600. These are all endangered and threatened species. Manatees and dolphins, also some record numbers. And we care about them because they're mammals like us. We care about them all, but it gets closer to home. So what we do know is that there are no standards, no thresholds that are established for exposure to these toxins. But we know that at about 10,000 cells per liter, you start to get those sensations. Well, most people do. There's a guy in our marine lab who is immune, I think. But he started to feel it when it got at its worst at 200 million cells per liter. And the water literally turned to a gel-like substance. So that's when he felt it in a big way. But you really don't want to be exposing yourself to any of this. We had kept a running count of the different species that were affected, and it was truly devastating. In fact, Audrey, our shorebird surveyor staff member, said, boy, there are some of these species I've read about, but I've never seen till they washed up dead on the beach. So there's a lesson in everything, but not one that we want to repeat. Our marine lab did some investigations, and on the left-hand side, what you see is they're sampling for the red tide toxins. The reddish red areas are, the deepest red areas are 200 million cells per liter, but the lightest colored areas are still, the yellow areas are still 100 million cells per liter. This was a blanket of toxins. And from August to October, our Marine Lab staff bravely dove down into these areas trying to find the edges. What they never did find the edges. They found about 242 square miles of a complete dead zone and never found the edges. What they found was that the water had stratified, and all of the toxins had killed things that had eliminated the oxygen on the bottom of that layer. So when they went to look at a crab that was sitting there, it just fell over. It wasn't really there. The sea stars disintegrated in their hands. It was just a toxic gas that had taken over the bottom. Tropical Storm Gordon, I think it was, and then Hurricane Michael were the two things that finally mixed up the water column and eliminated that dead zone. That's a pretty high price to pay. And in prices to pay, we have never seen these kinds of economic impacts either. So over $46 million of economic loss across all industries for just the 6 months from July through December, and that's just on Sanibel and Captiva. We had another $41 million on Fort Myers Beach, and it went on and on. Of course, workers were out of work. We had fish on Sanibel and Harry Chapin Food Bank on Fort Myers Beach coming to feed our neighbors and friends because there was nobody coming to the beaches. We had 78% cancellation rate. It was pretty dire, and these are impacts that we've never seen before. So we do know what the solutions are, and the good news is that these are at hand. They fall into two categories: projects to restore some of that capacity to store water that we've lost, and policies that can help improve water quality. So just talking quickly about two of them, and I know Shannon will say a little bit more. On the upper image, you see what we're calling the EAA reservoir, or the Everglades Reservoir. This is the state-owned land south of the lake in the Everglades agricultural area that will allow us to move water out of the lake. Because the key is that you've got to get water out of the lake to prevent it from going to the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie, this one project will have a 40 to 60% improvement in our harmful flows. If you put all the other projects together, you don't get close. So this is a critically important project. It's been approved by the federal government and the state government, and we're getting ready to get it started. And so that's the good news. The lower image is in our watershed out by Hendry County. It's a reservoir that is designed to capture watershed runoff near the south side of the river so that water can be made available during the dry season to meet our dry season needs, so we don't depend only on the lake. It's only about 30% of the storage need, but it's the biggest project we have in the watershed. So this one is under construction and will be finished in about 2 years. We do need one other project, and that's outlined in red, and that's a water quality treatment component. We do not run the risk, no matter what you hear someone say, that we could ever clean the water up too much around here. I think we proved that in those former slides. And then the third project I want to mention is the way we manage Lake Okeechobee. And I don't expect, there's not going to be a test, I don't expect you to memorize all this, but I do want you to realize that it's not arbitrary the way water is managed out of Lake Okeechobee. Depending on the color scheme of the level of the lake, that informs a flow chart there on the bottom that says if you have these conditions and there are these other conditions, you follow that along and you're going to release water here in this much volume and for this long. So this is how complicated it is. And this image here with the arrows shows you all the different places that want that water, that get a piece of that water. So that's a snapshot, 1 day's worth of decision making about how much water is coming in from the north, what the lake level is, and all the different places it needs to go. So this is a project that is currently being reviewed, and the Corps of Engineers is taking comments through the end of March. We will be sending out an alert with some talking points. If you want to engage, you'll be able to write a letter as well. So those are the projects. Then we've got the policies. So these policies are all about water quality because that's our highest need. That's our highest interest right now. And the good news is these are all state issues. No matter what you were during the campaign, blaming the Corps, blaming other people, these are all state issues. And the other good news is we have a governor who just came out and said he's going to prioritize all of these issues, which is, we haven't heard this before, so we're very happy with that. And top of our list is establishing those standards for toxins. Florida is the largest recreational shoreline in the lower 48 states. But we do not have any standards for these blue-green algae blooms, even though we have them. 20 states in the nation do have them, and so we're asking the state to establish those standards. And then we start testing the air, the water, the sand, because these are all about public health. And that's where the economy really starts to intersect with our quality of life. Things like stormwater rules. Our stormwater rules are 25 years old in Florida. If any of you have been coming down here or lived here for 25 years, you know the air has changed a little bit in that time, and that's affected the water quality. So there are opportunities for us to work with agriculture and work with urban environments to use 21st century technologies to address water quality. We just haven't had the political will. Septic inspection and maintenance, we had a bill back in, a rule that passed back in 2010, and the next year the legislature rescinded it. It's still a good idea. Every 5 years or so, inspect, maintain septic systems, because septic systems have nitrogen that feeds through the groundwater. Fertilizer, all the issues about protecting wetlands, these are all teed up for this year's legislative session. And the really good news is that this governor has said these are his priorities. He's announced, and this isn't an ad for the governor. I just have to say that it's the first time in a long time we've had this kind of leadership, which is what we need. $2.5 billion over the next 4 years to fund Everglades work and water quality work. That's $1 billion more than has ever been allocated for these resources. Creating a blue-green algae task force, creating a red tide harmful algal bloom task force, creating an office of a science officer, and reestablishing environmental enforcement. Just a few of the many things that are teed up. And that's good news, but I have to say he can't do that alone. So with his leadership and giving us this opening, now it's up to the rest of us to step up, and we will talk about ways we can do that. By signing up for action alerts, you'll have news that can come right into your email box, and you can read what the issue is. If it speaks to you, you can push a red button there at the bottom, and it'll take you to a page, and you can customize a letter, or you can send the letter that we format. And when you hit that button a second time, it goes to whoever is making the decision, voting on a bill or passing a law. And you will get a note back that says, thank you, you just contacted the governor, the Water Management District, the Corps of Engineers, the legislature. So it's a really effective way that from your seat in your desk, you can be part of the solution and helping, because it is ultimately a numbers game. And I understand that there is a flyer that we put on your seats that help you find that, where to sign up for that on our website. We also have established a legislative tracker for the past several years. They're on our website. You can take a look at the different bills that we're tracking. We will tell you if we support them, oppose them. We'll give you a bill summary, and we'll talk about if there's an action item. We'll give you that information, and that's when you can take action. So that'll be there. And we, believe it or not, have the legislative session beginning next Tuesday. It's only 60 days long, so that's the good news. But it does start, and so we're all in this together. If anybody would like to come with us to Tallahassee, we'll celebrate Everglades Action Day on April 8th and 9th. We take a bus up, and we set up meetings, and we go and speak to our legislators. And I will tell you that when they see faces other than Shannon's and mine and other people that you know that do this all the time, they take notice. I mean, we're good looking and all, but and productive, informative, and all the rest. But when they see faces they haven't seen before, they understand this is a bigger issue than just a lobbying issue. So that is the basis that I'm going to leave you with, so that Shannon can build on that and talk more about Everglades restoration, and then we'll take